Margaret Johnson walked into that courthouse barefoot. Her husband had taken everything: her shoes, her dignity, her 23 years of devotion. He sat there in his $1,000 suit, laughing with his lawyer, pointing at her cracked feet on the cold marble floor. "Your Honor," Richard said, "she can't even afford shoes. How's she going to afford a lawyer?" The whole courtroom laughed. Margaret didn't flinch. She reached into her worn cotton dress and pulled out a single photograph. Richard's face went white. If you want to see what happened next, subscribe to our channel and watch until the end. Comment your city below. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. The courtroom in Montgomery, Alabama, smelled like old wood and fresh betrayal. Margaret Johnson stood alone at the defendant's table. No lawyer beside her. No family behind her. Just a 57-year-old black woman in a faded blue dress that she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past 6 years. Across the aisle, Richard Thompson sat like a king holding court. White, wealthy, surrounded by 3 attorneys in matching gray suits. His new girlfriend, Amber, barely 30 years old, sat right behind him, filing her nails like she was waiting for a manicure instead of watching a marriage die. Judge Harold Patterson looked over his glasses at the scene before him. 40 years on the bench, and he'd seen plenty of divorces. But something about this one made his stomach turn. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I see you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" Margaret lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Honor." Richard snorted, loud enough for everyone to hear. His lead attorney, William Crawford, stood up with a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. "Your Honor, my client wishes to expedite these proceedings. Mrs. Johnson has no assets, no income, and no legal representation. We see no reason to drag this out."
"She ain't got nothing because she ain't worth nothing," Richard muttered.
Margaret's hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't speak. 23 years. She'd given that man 23 years of her life, raised his children when their own mother abandoned them, nursed his dying mother for 4 years until the old woman passed in her arms, built his construction company from a pickup truck and a dream into a fleet of 40 vehicles and contracts worth millions. And now he sat there, calling her nothing. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Patterson said sharply, "you will conduct yourself with respect in my courtroom." Richard held up his hands in mock surrender. "Apologies, Your Honor. Just stating facts." Crawford cleared his throat. "As I was saying, Your Honor, Mr. Thompson is prepared to be generous. He's offering Mrs. Johnson a one-time payment of $5,000 and 30 days to vacate the marital home." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. $5,000. For 23 years. That came out to about $217 per year. Less than $1 a day for cooking his meals, washing his clothes, raising his children, building his empire, and warming his bed. "That's," Margaret started. "More than fair," Crawford interrupted. "Mrs. Johnson contributed nothing financially to this marriage. She has no education beyond high school, no professional skills, no—" "I built that company," Margaret said quietly. Richard laughed out loud. "You answered phones, sweetheart." "I did the books for 15 years. I negotiated your first 3 contracts. "Your Honor," Crawford said, talking over her like she wasn't even there. "My client has documentation showing that Thompson Construction was built entirely through his efforts and expertise. Mrs. Johnson was, at best, a domestic helper." Margaret closed her eyes. Domestic helper. She remembered the night Richard came home crying because he'd lost the Morrison contract, the one that would have bankrupted them. She remembered staying up until 3 in the morning, rewriting his proposal, finding the errors in his numbers, crafting the language that won them a second chance. She remembered driving 4 hours to meet with suppliers when Richard was too drunk to get out of bed. She remembered lying to inspectors about permits, covering for his mistakes, cleaning up his messes year after year after year. And now she was a domestic helper. "Mrs. Johnson," Judge Patterson said, his voice softer now, "do you have any documentation to support your claims?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer. "She doesn't, Your Honor," Crawford said. "We've already subpoenaed all relevant records. Mrs. Johnson's name appears nowhere in the company documentation. She was never an employee, never a partner, never an officer of the corporation." Because Richard had made sure of that. Margaret remembered now, all those papers he'd asked her to sign over the years. "Just tax stuff, baby. You know I hate paperwork." She'd trusted him, signed whatever he put in front of her, never read the fine print, never realized she was signing away her own life. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the hurricane inside her chest. "I may not have papers with my name on them, but I have 23 years of service to this man and his family. I have witnesses who saw me build that company alongside him. I have—" "Witnesses," Richard scoffed. "Who? Your mama? Your church friends? Please." "Richard," the warning in Judge Patterson's voice was clear. But Richard was on a roll now. He stood up, ignoring his lawyer's hand on his arm, and pointed directly at Margaret. "Let me tell you something about this woman, Your Honor. She came to me with nothing. Nothing. A high school diploma and a waitress uniform. I gave her a home. I gave her a life. I gave her my family to care for when their own mother ran off. And how does she repay me?" He pulled out his phone, held it up like evidence. "I got messages here, Your Honor. Messages between my wife and some man named Jerome. You want to see what kind of woman she really is?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Jerome Washington was her cousin, her first cousin, who had been helping her look for an apartment these past few weeks since Richard threw her out. The messages between them were about rental prices and bus routes and whether she could afford a security deposit. But Richard knew that. He knew exactly what those messages were, and he was twisting them into something ugly right here in open court. "Your Honor, that's my cousin," Margaret said. "He's been helping me find somewhere to live since Mr. Thompson locked me out of our home." "Our home?" Richard laughed. "My home. My name on the deed. My money paying the mortgage. My home." Crawford stepped forward, smooth as silk. "Your Honor, my client isn't making accusations. He's simply demonstrating that Mrs. Johnson has other resources available to her. Perhaps she should pursue those avenues rather than seeking to profit from a marriage she clearly didn't value." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. "I valued that marriage," she said quietly. "I gave it everything I had." "Then why don't you have anything to show for it?" Richard shot back. "Because you took it all," Margaret thought. "Because every time I tried to save something for myself, you found it. Because you kept me dependent on purpose. Because you knew this day was coming." She'd found out about Amber 6 months ago. Walked into Richard's office at the construction yard and found them together on his desk. He hadn't even apologized, just told her to get out and stop being dramatic. That night, he'd moved her belongings into the guest room. A week later, he'd changed the locks on their bedroom. A month after that, he'd drained their joint account, the only account with her name on it, and told her it was for business expenses. And 3 weeks ago, he'd come home with a suitcase and told her to pack. "You got 30 minutes, he'd said. "Take whatever you can carry." She'd begged him to let her stay until she found somewhere to go. He'd called the police and had her escorted off the property for trespassing. her own home of 23 years. Trespassing. Your Honor, Crawford was saying, we're prepared to finalize this today. The terms are simple. Mrs. Johnson receives $5,000, signs a non-disclosure agreement regarding any claims against Thompson Construction, and vacates any claim to marital property. In exchange, my client will not pursue damages for her indiscretions. Those weren't indiscretions, Margaret said, her voice rising for the first time. I didn't do anything wrong.
Then why'd you delete all those messages, Margaret? Richard asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Why'd you wipe your phone the day after I found out? Because he'd thrown it against the wall so hard it shattered, and she'd had to get a new one. Because she couldn't afford to recover the data from a broken phone. Because she didn't know she'd need to prove her own innocence. But how could she explain that without sounding pathetic? Your Honor, I need time, Margaret said. I need time to find the lawyer, to gather evidence, to— We've already granted 2 continuances, Your Honor, Crawford interrupted. My client's life has been on hold for 4 months while Mrs. Johnson figures out what she already knows, that she has no case. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying both parties. Margaret saw something flicker across his face. Sympathy, maybe, or pity. She wasn't sure which was worse. Mrs. Johnson, he said slowly, the court does have concerns about the disparity here. Mr. Thompson has substantial assets, and you have nothing. Is that an accurate assessment? Margaret thought about the $47 in her checking account. The air mattress she was sleeping on in her cousin Jerome's basement. The 3 outfits she'd managed to grab before Richard's deadline expired. That's accurate, Your Honor. And you have no means to secure legal representation? No, sir. She could get a job, Amber called out from behind Richard, like the rest of us. A few people in the gallery snickered. Judge Patterson silenced them with a look. Young lady, you will not speak in my courtroom unless addressed. Amber rolled her eyes but went back to her nails. Mrs. Johnson, the judge continued, I'm inclined to grant one final continuance, 30 days. I strongly suggest you use that time to find some form of representation. Pro bono services, legal aid, something. This court cannot, in good conscience, finalize terms that are so obviously— With all due respect, Your Honor, Crawford said, standing straighter now. My client has been more than patient. He's been separated from his assets, unable to make business decisions, living in limbo for 4 months. At some point, justice delayed becomes justice denied. I understand your client's position, Mr. Crawford. Then perhaps we could proceed with a preliminary ruling. At least establish the baseline so my client can— She can't even afford a lawyer, Richard burst out, slamming his hand on the table. Look at her. She's got nothing. She is nothing. And she's wasting everyone's time trying to pretend like she matters. The courtroom went silent. Margaret stood perfectly still. She'd heard those words before. Not in a courtroom, but in their bedroom, their kitchen, their living room. She'd heard them whispered and shouted, spoken in anger and in cold calculation. She'd heard them so many times that she'd almost started to believe them. Almost. But standing here now, with nothing left to lose, something shifted inside her. Some piece of herself that she'd buried 23 years ago, the day she married a man who promised to love her forever. That piece was waking up. Mr. Thompson, Judge Patterson said, his voice like thunder, you are in contempt of this court. One more outburst and you will spend the night in a cell. Do I make myself clear? Richard's jaw tightened, but he sat down. Yes, Your Honor. Good. The judge turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Johnson, Your Honor, Margaret said, and something in her voice made everyone stop. She reached into the pocket of her worn blue dress, the same pocket that had held grocery lists and church bulletins and children's drawings for more than 2 decades. The pocket she'd sewn herself, because Richard refused to buy her clothes with pockets. Said they ruined the line of her figure.
She pulled out a photograph. It was old, creased from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The colors had faded, but the image was still clear. A young black woman in a nurse's uniform, standing next to a white man in a hospital bed. The man was smiling, holding up a document of some kind. The woman was crying. Richard's face went pale. "What is that?" His voice cracked. "You know what it is," Margaret said quietly. That's nothing. That doesn't mean anything." "Your Honor," Margaret said, stepping forward, "may I approach the bench?" Judge Patterson nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Margaret walked forward. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold marble floor. She moved past Richard, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to smell the fear. 23 years she'd been afraid of this man. 23 years she'd walked on eggshells, measured her words, hidden her thoughts. 23 years she'd played the role of the dutiful wife, the grateful servant, the woman who knew her place. That woman was gone. She placed the photograph on Judge Patterson's bench. The judge looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Richard, then back at the photograph. "Mrs. Johnson," he said slowly, "is this what I think it is?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you have documentation to support this?" Margaret smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in months. "I have documentation, Your Honor. I have witnesses. I have records that go back 40 years. She paused, letting the words sink in. "And I have a story that Mr. Thompson really doesn't want told in open court." Behind her, she heard Crawford whispering frantically to Richard. She heard Amber asking what was going on. She heard the gallery stirring, sensing blood in the water. But she kept her eyes on the judge. "Your Honor," Crawford said, scrambling to his feet. "Whatever Mrs. Johnson is implying, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Perhaps we could recess to discuss." "Sit down, Mr. Crawford." "But, Your Honor, I said sit down." Crawford sat. Judge Patterson picked up the photograph, studied it again. When he looked at Margaret, there was something new in his eyes. Not pity anymore. Something closer to respect. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I think we need to have a conversation. In my chambers. Right now." He stood. The bailiff called for the court to rise. Margaret turned to look at Richard one last time. He was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. Like the woman he'd thrown away was suddenly someone else entirely. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "what I know." Then she followed the judge out of the courtroom, leaving her husband's world crumbling behind her. The door closed with a sound like a coffin lid, and everything Richard Thompson thought he knew about Margaret Johnson was about to change forever. "That photograph," she said, "was taken at Montgomery General Hospital, October 15th, 1984. The woman in the nurse's uniform is me. I was 19 years old." Judge Patterson looked at the photograph again. "And the man in the bed?" "Harold Thompson Sr., Richard's father." The judge's eyebrows rose. "I knew Harold. He passed about, 15 years ago?" 16. And before he died, Your Honor, he told me something. Something that Richard has spent his entire life trying to keep buried." She paused. The words were right there, waiting to come out. But speaking them meant changing everything. It meant admitting that her whole marriage had been built on a lie. Not her lie, but Richard's. "Harold Thompson Sr. was not a wealthy man when I met him," Margaret continued. "He was dying of cancer, alone in a hospital room, abandoned by his own family. His wife had left him years before.
His son, Richard, hadn't visited in months.
And you were his nurse? I was a nursing assistant, minimum wage, working double shifts to help my mama pay rent. Margaret's voice caught. Harold was the kindest patient I ever had. He never complained about the pain, never took his anger out on the staff. He wanted someone to talk to. So you talked to him. Every night. After my shifts, I'd sit with him, read him newspapers, tell him stories about my day. He said I reminded him of someone he used to know. Margaret looked down at her hands. Someone he'd loved and lost a long time ago. Judge Patterson leaned forward. Mrs. Johnson, what exactly did Harold Thompson tell you? He told me about the land, Your Honor. What land? 300 acres in Russell County. Land that had been in the Thompson family for 4 generations. Land that Harold had signed over to his son Richard 2 years before, when he got too sick to manage it himself. Margaret met the judge's eyes. Land that Richard sold 6 months later, for $4 million. The judge went still. Harold didn't know about the sale until it was too late, Margaret continued. He signed those papers thinking Richard would take care of the family legacy. Instead, Richard took the money and told his dying father that the land had been seized for back taxes. That's fraud. Yes, Your Honor, it is. Judge Patterson stood up, walked to his window. His back was to Margaret when he spoke again. Mrs. Johnson, fraud is a serious accusation. Do you have proof? I have Harold's journal. 47 pages, written in his own hand, documenting everything. The original deed showing the land transfer. Bank records showing where the money went. And a sworn statement that Harold dictated to me 3 days before he died, naming Richard as the one who betrayed him. She reached into her pocket again, pulled out a small brass key. Everything is in a safety deposit box in Birmingham. Has been for 40 years. I've been paying $12 a month to keep it there, even when I didn't have money for food. Because Harold made me promise. Promise what? That I would protect the truth until the time was right. Margaret's voice hardened. He knew what his son was. He knew Richard would destroy anyone who tried to expose him. So he gave the evidence to the one person Richard would never suspect, a poor black nursing assistant that nobody would ever think twice about. Judge Patterson turned around. His face was unreadable. Mrs. Johnson, why are you telling me this now? Why not years ago, when Harold died? Because Harold asked me not to. I don't understand. Margaret closed her eyes. This was the part that still hurt, even after all these years. Harold Thompson was a complicated man, Your Honor. He hated what Richard had done to him. But he was still Richard's father. He couldn't bear the thought of his only son going to prison. She opened her eyes. So he made me promise to keep the evidence hidden unless Richard did something unforgivable. Something that proved beyond any doubt that he was beyond redemption. And throwing you out of your home after 23 years of marriage qualifies? That's not what qualifies, Your Honor. The judge waited. Margaret pulled out another photograph. This one was newer, taken just 6 months ago. It showed Richard standing outside a building with a sign that read, Thompson Senior Living. He had his arm around Amber, and they were both laughing. 3 months ago, Margaret said, Richard moved his mother into that facility. Eleanor Thompson, 84 years old. Dementia. He told everyone it was for her own good, that she needed professional care. That's not uncommon. No, it's not. But here's what is uncommon, Your Honor. Margaret's voice went cold. Richard isn't paying for her care. He told the facility that Eleanor has no family, no assets, and no insurance. She's been classified as indigent. Medicaid is covering everything. But you said Richard has substantial assets. He does. Millions. But he hid them in shell companies, transferred property to Amber's name.
buried his wealth so deep that on paper he looks like he's barely getting by. Margaret leaned forward. He abandoned his own mother to die in a Medicaid bed, while he lives in a mansion with his mistress. Just like he abandoned his father 40 years ago. Judge Patterson sat down heavily. Jesus. That's why I'm telling you now, Your Honor. Because Harold's worst fear came true. His son didn't just betray him once. He's doing it again. To everyone who ever loved him. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the judge picked up his phone. Carol, I need you to pull every filing related to Thompson Construction from the past 5 years. And get me the contact information for Adult Protective Services in Russell County. Margaret heard a voice respond on the other end.
I don't care how long it takes, the judge said. This is priority 1.
He hung up and looked at Margaret with something like admiration. Mrs. Johnson, do you understand what you've just done? If even half of what you're telling me is true, Richard Thompson is looking at criminal charges, fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation. We're talking prison time. I understand, Your Honor. And you're prepared for what comes next? Because once this gets out, Richard is going to fight back. Hard. He's got money, lawyers, connections. He's going to try to destroy you. Margaret stood up. For the first time all day, she felt like herself again. Not the woman Richard had tried to make her. Not the victim he'd created. But the woman Harold Thompson Sr. had seen all those years ago. Strong, smart, and utterly unafraid. Your Honor, she said, that man has been trying to destroy me for 23 years. He took my home, my dignity, my life's work. He left me barefoot in a courthouse and laughed while his lawyers picked my bones. She picked up the photograph of Harold Sr. But he forgot something important. He forgot that his own father chose me. Out of everyone in the world, Harold Thompson Sr. trusted a 19-year-old nursing assistant with his family's darkest secret. And I have been carrying that trust every single day since. She put the photograph back in her pocket. Richard Thompson thinks he married a nobody. He's about to find out that he married the keeper of his kingdom's keys. Judge Patterson almost smiled. Almost. Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to call a recess until tomorrow morning. I need time to verify what you've told me and make some calls. Can you get to the courthouse by 9 a.m.? I'll be here at 8. Good. The judge stood, walked her to the door. One more thing. When you go back out there, Richard is going to try to talk to you. His lawyers are going to try to negotiate. Whatever they offer, don't take it. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Just go home and wait for my call. Your Honor, I don't have a home anymore. The judge paused. Something shifted in his face. Where are you staying? My cousin's basement, Jerome, Washington. He's the only family I have left. The one Richard accused you of having an affair with? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Patterson shook his head slowly. Mrs. Johnson, I've been doing this job for 40 years. I've seen a lot of bad men. But Richard Thompson, he trailed off. He's not bad, Your Honor. He's empty. There's a difference. What do you mean? Margaret thought about it. A bad man knows right from wrong and chooses wrong anyway. Richard doesn't even see the choice. He looks at other people and all he sees is what they can do for him. His father was useful until he got sick. His mother was useful until she got old. I was useful until I got worn out. She paused. Now Amber is useful. Until she's not. You almost sound sorry for him. I'm not sorry for him, Your Honor. I'm sorry for the person he could have been, if anyone had ever taught him that people aren't tools. The judge opened the door. The noise of the courthouse flooded back in,
Voices, footsteps, the hum of a building full of broken promises. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 8 a.m. "I'll be here." Margaret walked out of the chambers and into the hallway. She could see Richard at the end of the corridor, surrounded by his lawyers. They were all talking at once, gesturing wildly. Amber stood off to the side, looking confused and annoyed. When Richard saw Margaret, he started toward her. Crawford grabbed his arm. "Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't." "She's lying," Richard said, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. "Whatever she told that judge, it's all lies." Margaret kept walking. Her bare feet made no sound on the marble. People stepped aside to let her pass, staring at this woman who had nothing, and somehow commanded more attention than the millionaire screaming behind her. "Margaret!" Richard's voice was desperate now. "Margaret, you can't do this! I'll give you whatever you want. The house, money, just tell me what you want." She stopped, turned, looked at the man she'd spent 23 years loving. "I want," she said quietly, "exactly what I deserve." Then she walked out of the courthouse. Jerome was waiting for her in his old pickup truck. He took one look at her face and started the engine without asking questions. They drove in silence through the streets of Montgomery, past the houses Margaret used to clean before she met Richard, past the church where they'd gotten married, past the construction yard where she'd built his empire, one contract at a time. "You okay?" Jerome finally asked. "No." "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet." Fair enough. They pulled up to Jerome's house, a small brick ranch on the east side of town. Margaret's mama had grown up 3 blocks from here. She'd died 10 years ago, never knowing what her daughter was carrying. Inside, Margaret went straight to the basement. Her air mattress was in the corner, next to a stack of boxes filled with everything she'd managed to save from her marriage. Photos, letters, a wedding dress she'd never wear again. She sat on the mattress and pulled out her phone. 1 bar of signal. It would have to be enough. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 16 years. It rang 3 times before a woman answered. "Law offices of Patricia Okonkwo. How may I direct your call?" "I need to speak to Patricia. Tell her it's Margaret. Margaret Johnson." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Ms. Okonkwo is in court today. Can I take a message?" "Tell her..." Margaret paused. "Tell her Harold's promise is ready to be kept." Silence on the other end. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "She'll understand. Just tell her exactly what I said. Harold's promise is ready to be kept." I'll give her the message." Margaret hung up, lay back on the air mattress and stared at the ceiling. Jerome's basement was cold and damp and smelled like mildew. But for the first time in months, she felt something like peace. 40 years ago, Harold Thompson Sr. had told her that truth was like water. You could dam it up, divert it, try to hold it back, but eventually it always found its way through. The dam was breaking, and Richard Thompson had no idea what was about to hit him. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Hello?" Margaret. The voice on the other end was deep, familiar, and filled with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite name. "This is Patricia Okonkwo. I got your message." "Patricia, it's been a long time." 16 years. I thought I'd never hear from you again." A pause. "So, Harold's promise. You're really going to do it?" "He left me no choice, Patricia." "Tell me what happened." Margaret told her. Everything. The divorce, the courthouse, the photographs, the judge. When she finished, Patricia was silent for so long that Margaret thought the call had dropped. "Patricia, you still there?" "I'm here. I'm just processing." Another pause. "Margaret,
Do you remember what I told you the last time we spoke? 16 years ago, when you called to tell me you were marrying Richard? Margaret closed her eyes. You told me I was making a mistake. I told you that Harold trusted you with a weapon, and you were about to hand that weapon to the enemy. Patricia's voice was sharp now. I told you Richard would destroy you eventually. I told you to walk away while you still could. I know what you told me. And you didn't listen. I loved him, Patricia, or I thought I did. And now? Margaret thought about the man who had thrown her clothes into garbage bags, the man who had laughed while she begged for enough money to eat, the man who had abandoned his own mother to die in a Medicaid bed while he built a new life with a woman half his age. Now, she said, I'm ready to finish what Harold started. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said the words that Margaret had been waiting 16 years to hear. Then let's burn that bastard to the ground. The call ended. Margaret lay in the darkness of Jerome's basement, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Upstairs, she heard Jerome moving around, making dinner, probably. He always made too much food, like he was still cooking for the wife who'd left him 10 years ago. Every night, he'd bring a plate down to Margaret and sit with her while she ate, telling her stories about their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, all the family she'd nearly forgotten during her 23 years in Richard's world. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she recognized the number. Richard. She let it ring. It went to voicemail. A few seconds later, a text appeared. We need to talk. Name your price. Margaret typed back. You can't afford it. His response was immediate. Everyone has a price. She smiled. It was a cold smile, the kind she'd learned from years of watching Richard negotiate with suppliers and contractors and everyone else he'd ever crushed on his way to the top. Not everyone, she typed. Some of us have something more valuable than money. What's that? Margaret looked at the photograph of Harold Sr. one more time. Then she typed 3 words and hit send. The truth. She turned off her phone, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 23 years, she slept without dreaming of the man who had tried to destroy her. Tomorrow, she would start destroying him instead. Patricia Okonkwo arrived at Jerome's house at 6 in the morning, carrying 2 boxes of files and a look that could cut steel. She was 62 years old now, her hair gone silver, but her eyes were the same, sharp, relentless, hungry for justice. Margaret met her at the door. They stood there for a moment, 2 women who had once been close as sisters, separated by 16 years and one terrible choice. You look tired, Patricia said. I haven't slept properly in 6 months. That ends today. Patricia walked past her into the house. Where can we work? Kitchen table. Jerome's at his shift. Won't be back until 3. They spread the files across the table. Margaret watched Patricia organize everything with the precision of a surgeon. Harold's journal here, bank records there, the sworn statement in the center like a beating heart. I spent last night pulling everything I could find on Richard's current finances, Patricia said. He's been busy. Shell companies in Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming. Property transferred to Amber's name 6 months ago. Bank accounts emptied and refilled through a maze of LLCs that would take years to untangle. So he's been planning this. He's been planning this since the day he married you. Patricia looked up. Maybe before. The words hit Margaret like a fist. What do you mean? Patricia pulled out a document. This is Richard's prenuptial agreement with his first wife, Denise. You know about Denise? She left when the kids were small. Richard said she abandoned them. She didn't abandon anyone. Patricia's voice went hard. She tried to divorce him. Tried to take half of everything, including the money from his father's land sale. Richard buried her in legal fees,
threatened to take the kids, made her life so miserable that she signed away everything just to escape. Margaret felt sick. The children were leverage. Richard never wanted those kids. He wanted weapons. Patricia shook her head. Denise, last I heard, she's living in a women's shelter in Tennessee. Never recovered.
I raised those children, Margaret whispered. I loved them like my own.
I know you did. And where are they now? Margaret thought about Richard Jr., who hadn't called in 2 years. About Melissa, who sent a birthday card once and never responded to Margaret's messages. About how quickly they'd sided with their father when the divorce started.
They're with him.
Of course they are, because Richard made sure of it. He made sure everyone who ever loved you would turn their backs when the time came. Patricia reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. But he missed someone.
Who?
Eleanor.
Margaret blinked. His mother? She has dementia. She doesn't even know who I am anymore.
She knows more than you think. Patricia pulled out another file. I visited her yesterday, at Thompson Senior Living.
You what?
I told them I was her niece. They don't check. Nobody checks on the indigent patients. Patricia's jaw tightened.
Margaret, she's being neglected. Bed sores, malnutrition. They've got her on sedatives that no doctor prescribed. And when I said your name, she grabbed my hand so hard I thought she'd break my fingers.
Margaret's heart stopped.
What did she say? She said, "Tell Margaret to look in the piano." The piano? That's all she would say. Look in the piano. Does that mean anything to you?
Margaret closed her eyes, remembered Eleanor's house, the one Richard had sold 3 years ago when he moved her into assisted living. Remembered the old upright piano in the parlor, the one Eleanor had played every Sunday afternoon while Margaret sat beside her, turning pages.
Eleanor's piano was sold with the house.
No, it wasn't, Patricia smiled. I checked. Richard put it in storage. Climate-controlled unit on the south side of town. Still there.
Why would he keep the piano?
Maybe he forgot about it. Maybe he couldn't be bothered to deal with it. Or maybe... Patricia leaned forward. Maybe his mother hid something inside, and he never thought to look. Margaret stood up so fast, her chair fell over. We need to get into that storage unit. Already ahead of you. Patricia held up a key. Eleanor's name is still on the lease. As her concerned family member, I was able to obtain access. Patricia, how did you... Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. Patricia grabbed her purse. Let's go. They drove across town in Patricia's Lincoln. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her mind racing. What had Eleanor hidden? What secret had survived the years, the dementia, the neglect? The storage facility was a maze of identical units. They found Eleanor's near the back, a small space barely big enough for a car. Patricia unlocked the door. It swung open with a groan. The piano sat in the center, covered in dust. A few boxes surrounded it, labeled in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Christmas ornaments. Harold's things. Photos 1960 to 1980. Margaret approached the piano slowly. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, exposing the yellowed keys. Where would she hide something? Patricia asked. The bench. Margaret remembered Eleanor keeping her sheet music in the bench seat. She always said that bench held all her treasures. She lifted the cushioned seat. Inside, sheet music was stacked neatly, just as Eleanor had left it years ago. But underneath the music, wrapped in a faded silk scarf, was a manila envelope. Margaret's name was written on the front. Open it, Patricia breathed. Margaret's fingers felt numb. She peeled back the flap, reached inside, and pulled out a stack of papers. The first was a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 6 years ago, before the dementia had taken hold.
My dear Margaret, Margaret read aloud. If you're reading this, then my son has finally shown you who he really is. I'm sorry. I should have warned you. I should have stopped the wedding. But I was a coward, and I was afraid of losing my grandchildren. She paused, her voice breaking. Keep reading, Patricia said softly. Harold tried to tell me what Richard had done, about the land, the money, all of it. But I didn't want to believe him. My own son, a thief, a liar. I convinced myself Harold was confused, bitter, dying. I convinced myself Richard would change. Margaret wiped her eyes, kept reading. He didn't change. He got worse. I watched him destroy his first wife. I watched him manipulate you. I watched him turn my grandchildren into strangers who don't even know their own mother's grave. Wait, Margaret looked at Patricia. Denise is dead? Patricia's face went pale. What? When? Margaret read faster now. Denise didn't abandon those children, Margaret. She tried to fight for them. And when she couldn't win, she gave up. Richard told the children she ran away. He told everyone she ran away. But I found the death certificate. It's in this envelope. Margaret's hands shook as she dug through the papers. There it was. A death certificate from mother's grave. Wait, Margaret looked at Patricia. Denise is dead? Patricia's face went pale. What? When? Margaret read faster now. Denise didn't abandon those children, Margaret. She tried to fight for them. And when she couldn't win, she gave up. Richard told the children she ran away. He told everyone she ran away. But I found the death certificate. It's in this envelope. Margaret's hands shook as she dug through the papers. There it was. A death certificate from Tennessee. Denise Marie Thompson. Cause of death? Suicide. Oh my God, Patricia whispered. Richard knew. Margaret's voice was hollow. He knew she was dead, and he let those children believe their mother abandoned them. For 20 years. That's why they're so loyal to him. That's why they turned against you. Patricia grabbed Margaret's arm. He didn't just lie to you. He weaponized a dead woman against her own children. Margaret kept reading Eleanor's letter. There's more here, Margaret. Things I've collected over the years. Bank statements Richard thought he'd destroyed. Recordings of phone calls. And one thing that Richard doesn't know exists. A second will that Harold signed 3 days before he died.
A second will? Patricia grabbed the papers, rifling through them. Harold's will left everything to Richard. That's public record. That was the first will. The one Richard's lawyer drew up when Harold was too sick to know what he was signing. Margaret found the document at the bottom of the stack. This is the real will. The one Harold wrote himself, with witnesses, 2 weeks before the lawyer showed up. Patricia read it. Her face went through about 17 different emotions in 10 seconds. Margaret, her voice was barely a whisper. This will, it leaves everything to you. What? Not just Harold's estate. Everything, including a 51% ownership stake in Thompson Construction. Patricia looked up. Richard doesn't own his own company. You do. Margaret sat down hard on Eleanor's piano bench. 51%. For 40 years, she'd been the rightful majority owner of Thompson Construction, and she never knew. Why didn't Harold tell me? She asked. He did tell you. Patricia pointed to the letter. He gave you the key to the safety deposit box. He made you promise to protect the truth. He was waiting for you to find this. But Eleanor had it. Because Harold gave her a copy. He knew Richard might find the safety deposit box. He knew the only truly safe place was with someone Richard would never suspect, his own mother, who Richard dismissed as useless the moment she stopped being convenient. Margaret looked at the papers in her hands. Harold's handwriting. Harold's signature. Harold's final gift to the woman who had shown him kindness when no one else would. This changes everything, she said.
This changes everything, Patricia agreed. And there's something else you need to know. What? Patricia pulled out her phone. Last night, after our call, I made some inquiries. Richard's lawyers? Crawford and Associates? They're not divorce lawyers, Margaret. They're corporate restructuring specialists. What does that mean? It means Richard isn't trying to divorce you. He's trying to liquidate you. Patricia showed Margaret a document on her phone. This is a filing from 2 days ago. Richard is claiming that Thompson Construction is in financial distress. He's asking the court to allow him to sell off assets, including the company itself, to cover debts. He's selling the company? He's trying to sell it before you can claim your share. Patricia's eyes were blazing now. He knew about Harold's will. He must have. Why else would he be trying to dump everything so fast? But how could he know? Eleanor never told him. Maybe Eleanor let something slip. Maybe he found something in her things when he moved her to the facility. Or maybe, Patricia paused, maybe someone else told him. Who? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. They drove back to Jerome's house in silence. Margaret's mind was spinning. 51%. She owned 51% of a company worth millions. She owned the company that Richard had built on lies and stolen land and her own labor for 23 years. She owned him. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. Don't answer it, Patricia said. But something made Margaret pick up anyway. Mrs. Johnson? The voice was smooth, professional, not Richard. This is William Crawford. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Crawford. Then just listen. A pause. My client is prepared to offer you a settlement. $2 million. Cash. No strings attached. You sign the divorce papers, walk away, and never speak of any of this again. $2 million. 6 months ago, Margaret would have taken that offer in a heartbeat. 6 months ago, she would have thanked God for such mercy. But 6 months ago, she didn't know what she knew now. Mr. Crawford, she said calmly, please tell your client that I decline his offer. Mrs. Johnson, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. Your client is scared. He should be. Margaret's voice went cold. Tell him I'll see him in court tomorrow, and tell him to bring a good lawyer. He's going to need one. She hung up. Patricia was staring at her with something like pride. That, Patricia said, was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I'm not done yet. What do you mean? Margaret looked at the papers in her lap. Harold's will, Eleanor's letter, Denise's death certificate. 40 years of secrets, finally coming into the light. Richard took everything from me, she said. My home, my dignity, my life. But he made one mistake. What's that? Margaret smiled. It was not a kind smile. He forgot that I learned from the best. I watched him destroy people for 23 years. I learned every trick, every tactic, every dirty move in his playbook. She gathered the papers carefully, and now I'm going to use every single one of them against him. Margaret? Patricia's voice was cautious. Revenge is dangerous. It can consume you. This isn't revenge, Patricia. Margaret looked at her old friend, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. This is justice. For Harold. For Eleanor. For Denise. For every person Richard Thompson has ever destroyed. She stood up. And tomorrow, in that courtroom, I'm going to make him watch while everything he built comes crashing down around him. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. Then let's get to work. We've got a lot to do before 9 a.m. They worked through the night, organizing documents, preparing arguments,
anticipating every move Richard's lawyers might make. By the time Jerome came home from his shift, the kitchen table looked like a war room. "What's all this?" he asked. "The end," Margaret said. "Or the beginning. I'm not sure which." Jerome looked at the papers, the files, the photographs. Then he looked at his cousin, the woman who had been sleeping on an air mattress in his basement, the woman Richard Thompson had tried to erase from existence. "You need anything?" he asked. "Food? Coffee? A shotgun?" Margaret laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in months. "Just your prayers, Jerome. And maybe some breakfast." "I can do both." He disappeared into the kitchen. Margaret heard pots clanging, smelled bacon frying. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a life she'd almost forgotten existed. Her phone buzzed one more time. Richard. This time, she answered. "What do you want?" "Margaret." His voice was different now, desperate, pleading. "Margaret, please. Whatever you're planning, don't do it. I'll give you anything. The house, the cars, everything. Just, please, don't do this." "Why, Richard? Why shouldn't I do exactly what you would do in my position?" "Because," he was crying, actually crying. "Because I love you." Margaret closed her eyes. 23 years. 23 years of that word, thrown around like it meant something. 23 years of, "I love you," followed by lies, manipulation, cruelty. 23 years of believing that love was supposed to hurt. "No, Richard," she said quietly. "You don't love me. You don't know how to love anyone. You only know how to use people. And when they're used up, you throw them away." "That's not true." "It is true. And tomorrow, the whole world is going to see it." She hung up, turned off the phone, set it on the table beside Harold's will and Eleanor's letter and Denise's death certificate. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Margaret Johnson would stop being invisible, and Richard Thompson would finally learn what it meant to lose everything. Margaret walked into that courthouse at exactly 8 o'clock, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn 2 days ago. But this time, she walked different, stood different, breathed different. Patricia was beside her, carrying a briefcase that weighed 15 pounds and contained 40 years of secrets. Jerome had insisted on coming too. He sat in the gallery now, wearing his Sunday suit, his hands folded like he was at church, waiting for the sermon to begin. Richard was already there with his lawyers. 3 of them today instead of 1. Crawford looked like he hadn't slept. The other 2 were frantically shuffling papers. And Amber wasn't there at all. Margaret noticed that immediately. "Where's his girlfriend?" she whispered to Patricia. "Don't know, don't care. Focus." Judge Patterson entered at exactly 9. His face gave away nothing as he took his seat. "This court is now in session. We're here to continue the matter of Thompson versus Thompson." He looked at Margaret, then at Richard. "I understand there have been some developments since our last hearing." "Your Honor," Crawford stood quickly. "My client wishes to address the court regarding—" "Sit down, Mr. Crawford. I'll tell you when to speak." Crawford sat. "Mrs. Johnson," the judge continued, "I've had the opportunity to review some of the materials you presented yesterday. I've also made several phone calls." He paused. "Adult Protective Services will be visiting Thompson Senior Living this afternoon." Richard's face went gray. "Additionally," the judge continued, "I've been in contact with the Alabama State Bar regarding certain irregularities in the corporate filings for Thompson Construction." Crawford was on his feet again. "Your Honor, my client has done nothing wrong. Whatever Mrs. Johnson has told you," "I said, sit down." "But, Your Honor—" "One more word, Mr. Crawford, and you'll be removed from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Crawford's mouth snapped shut. He sat. Judge Patterson turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand you have representation today?"
Patricia stood. Patricia Okonkwo, Your Honor. Attorney for Mrs. Johnson. Ms. Okonkwo, I've heard of you. Didn't you argue before the state Supreme Court back in 2008? I did, Your Honor. Won that one too. The faintest smile crossed the judge's face. Very well. Ms. Okonkwo, does your client wish to present additional evidence? She does, Your Honor. Quite a lot of it. Then proceed. Patricia opened her briefcase. Margaret watched Richard's face as the first document hit the table. Your Honor, this is a last will and testament signed by Harold Thompson Sr. on October 12, 1984, 3 days before his death. Patricia's voice was steady, surgical. This will, properly witnessed and notarized, supersedes the previous will filed with this court 16 years ago. Objection! Crawford was up again. This document was never entered into probate. It has no legal standing. Mr. Crawford, I warned you. Judge Patterson's voice cracked like a whip. One more interruption, and I'm holding you in contempt. Bailiff, be ready. Crawford looked at the bailiff. The bailiff looked eager. Crawford sat down. Continue, Miss Okonkwo. Your Honor, this will leaves the entirety of Harold Thompson Sr.'s estate, including a 51% ownership stake in what was then called Thompson Land Development, now Thompson Construction, to Margaret Louise Johnson. The gallery erupted. People who had come expecting a simple divorce hearing were suddenly watching something else entirely. Richard stood up. That's a lie. That will is a forgery. My father would never— Mr. Thompson, Judge Patterson slammed his gavel. Sit down and be quiet, or I will have you removed and held in contempt. But, Your Honor, she's lying. She's— Bailiff. The bailiff moved. Richard's lawyers grabbed him, pulled him back into his seat. He was shaking now, his face red with rage and fear. Miss Okonkwo, the judge said, I assume you have authentication for this document. I do, Your Honor. The signatures have been verified by 3 separate handwriting experts. The notary who witnessed the signing, now deceased, left records of the transaction in her files. And we have a sworn statement from a nurse who was present when Harold Thompson signed this will. A nurse? Patricia turned to look at Margaret. Margaret stood. Me, Your Honor. I was that nurse. I was 19 years old, working at Montgomery General Hospital. I was there when Harold Thompson wrote this will, and I was there when he signed it. The courtroom went completely silent. Mr. Thompson knew his son had stolen from him, Margaret continued. He knew Richard had sold the family land and lied about it. And he knew that Richard would try to destroy anyone who threatened to expose him. She paused. So he gave the evidence to someone Richard would never suspect, a poor black girl who nobody thought was worth anything. She looked at Richard. His face was the color of old paper. For 40 years I kept Harold's secret. I kept it through my marriage, through raising Richard's children, through building a company that I now know was legally half mine all along. Her voice broke slightly. I kept it because Harold asked me to wait until Richard showed the world who he really was. And now? Judge Patterson asked quietly. And now he has, Your Honor. He threw me out of my home with nothing. He abandoned his mother to die in a Medicaid bed while he hid millions in shell companies. He destroyed his first wife so completely that she— Margaret stopped, took a breath. That she took her own life. The gallery gasped. Your Honor, Patricia stepped forward. I have here a death certificate for Denise Marie Thompson, Richard's first wife. Cause of death? Suicide. Date of death? March 15th, 2004. For 20 years, Richard Thompson has told his children that their mother abandoned them. He has allowed them to believe she was alive somewhere, choosing not to be part of their lives. He lied to protect himself. Richard was shaking his head now. That's not— I didn't— Denise was— Denise was what, Mr. Thompson?
Patricia's voice was ice. Alive? Were you going to say alive? Richard looked at his lawyers. None of them would meet his eyes. I was protecting my children. You were protecting yourself. Because if your children knew the truth, that their mother killed herself after you destroyed her in court, they might have asked questions. They might have wondered if you'd do the same thing to someone else someday. Patricia turned to the judge. Which brings us to our next piece of evidence. She pulled out another document. This is a corporate filing from 2 days ago, submitted by Mr. Thompson's attorneys. It claims that Thompson Construction is in financial distress and needs to liquidate assets immediately. Patricia smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. The timing is interesting, don't you think? Just days before this hearing, Mr. Thompson suddenly needs to sell everything? My client has every right to manage his business affairs, Crawford muttered. His business affairs? Patricia laughed. Your Honor, Thompson Construction is worth approximately $14 million. According to Harold Thompson's will, 51% of that company belongs to Margaret Johnson. That's over $7 million that Richard Thompson was trying to steal by selling the company before this will could be presented. That will is a fake, Richard shouted. Then let's talk about something that isn't fake. Patricia pulled out a recording device. Your Honor, I have here a recording made by Eleanor Thompson 18 months ago, before her dementia had fully progressed. In this recording, she describes how her son Richard forged documents to have himself named sole beneficiary of his father's estate. She describes how he threatened her with institutionalization if she ever told anyone. And she describes how he moved her into a facility and told them she had no family, no assets, and no one who cared whether she lived or died. You can't play that, Crawford said. There are rules about— Actually, Mr. Crawford, Alabama law allows recordings made by one party to a conversation without the other party's consent. Patricia looked at the judge. Eleanor Thompson made this recording herself, with full knowledge of what she was doing. She wanted the truth to come out. She just didn't know how to make it happen. Judge Patterson rubbed his eyes. Play the recording. Patricia pressed a button. Eleanor's voice filled the courtroom, thin, trembling, but unmistakably clear. My name is Eleanor Marie Thompson. I am 82 years old, and I am making this recording because I am afraid of my son. Margaret closed her eyes. She could see Eleanor in her mind, sitting at that old piano, tears streaming down her face, speaking into a recorder that she probably didn't even know how to use. Richard has done terrible things. He stole from his father. He drove his first wife to suicide. And he has been lying to that sweet woman Margaret for over 20 years. Richard had his head in his hands now. I should have stopped him. I should have told Margaret the truth before she married him. But I was afraid. Richard said he would put me in a home and never visit. He said he would tell everyone I was crazy. He said no one would believe me over him. A sob escaped from somewhere in the gallery. But I kept copies of everything. The real will, the bank statements, everything Harold tried to protect before he died. I hid them in my piano, the one place Richard never looked, because he never cared about anything that mattered to me. The recording went on for another 10 minutes. Eleanor described Richard's fraud in detail. She named dates, amounts, accounts. She explained how Richard had used his lawyer, not Crawford, but a man who had died 8 years ago, to create false documents that redirected Harold's estate. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent. Judge Patterson looked at Richard. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to say? Richard raised his head. His face was wet with tears. Whether real or fake, Margaret couldn't tell. Your Honor, my mother is sick. She has dementia. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's been confused for years, and someone, probably Margaret, took advantage of that confusion to get her to make these false statements.
That recording was made 18 months ago, Patricia said, before Mrs. Thompson's dementia had significantly progressed. Medical records confirm she was still lucid at that time.
She was never lucid, Richard shouted. She's always been weak, confused, easily manipulated, just like my father. They were both... He stopped, realized what he was about to say, but it was too late. They were both what, Mr. Thompson? Judge Patterson's voice was quiet now, dangerous. Richard's lawyers were all talking at once, trying to stop him, but he couldn't seem to help himself. They were both fools, Your Honor. My father was a dying old man who didn't know what he was doing. My mother was a senile woman who can't remember her own name. And Margaret is a gold digger who saw an opportunity and took it. A gold digger? Margaret spoke for the first time in minutes. Her voice was steady. Richard, when I met you, you had nothing. Your father had disowned you. Your first wife had left you. You were living in a one-bedroom apartment with 2 children you didn't know how to raise.
That's not... I built your company, Richard. I raised your children. I cared for your mother when you couldn't be bothered. I did everything for you, and you repaid me by throwing me out like trash. You were never anything but a housekeeper, Richard spat. A maid, a convenience. I never loved you. I never even liked you. I married you because you were useful, and I divorced you because you weren't useful anymore. The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret looked at her husband, really looked at him, and felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. Not for herself, for him. For the man who had so little inside him that he could only feel powerful by destroying others. Your Honor, she said quietly, I think we've heard enough. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. I believe we have. He was quiet for a long moment. The whole courtroom held its breath. Mr. Thompson, the judge finally said, in my 40 years on this bench, I have seen a lot of ugly things. Men who beat their wives. Women who abandoned their children. People who lied, cheated, stole, and destroyed everything they touched. He leaned forward. But I have never seen anything quite like you. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Based on the evidence presented today, I am making the following preliminary rulings. First, the will of Harold Thompson Sr., dated October 12, 1984, appears to be authentic and will be submitted for immediate probate review. Second, any attempt by Mr. Thompson to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of assets belonging to Thompson Construction is hereby enjoined until the ownership question is resolved. Third, Adult Protective Services will conduct an immediate investigation into the care of Eleanor Thompson, and Mr. Thompson will be required to appear before a separate hearing on possible elder abuse charges. Richard looked like he might pass out. Fourth, the judge continued, this divorce proceeding is hereby stayed pending the outcome of the criminal investigation that I am personally recommending to the District Attorney's Office. The charges under consideration include fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. Criminal charges? Crawford finally found his voice. Your Honor, this is a civil matter. Not anymore, Mr. Crawford. When fraud and elder abuse are alleged, it becomes a criminal matter. I suggest you advise your client to retain a criminal defense attorney, because he's going to need one. The judge stood. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down like thunder. Richard sat frozen in his chair as people began filing out of the courtroom. His lawyers were already packing up, already distancing themselves from the disaster. Margaret walked over to him, stood there until he looked up at her. Why? He whispered. Why did you do this? She thought about that question, thought about all the answers she could give. Harold's trust, Eleanor's suffering, Denise's death, her own 23 years of service repaid with cruelty. But in the end,
She gave him the simplest answer of all. "Because you taught me how." She turned and walked away, leaving Richard Thompson alone with the ruins of his empire. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining. Patricia was talking to reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. Jerome was waiting by his truck, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. And Margaret Johnson, the woman who had walked into this courthouse barefoot and broken, stood on the steps and breathed in the sweet Alabama air. She wasn't finished yet. There would be more hearings, more battles, more of Richard's desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. But for the first time in 40 years, she knew how this story was going to end. She was going to win. And Richard Thompson was going to lose everything, just like his father had promised. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the lobby of Thompson Construction, her company now, legally and completely. The probate court had ruled in her favor 3 months ago. Harold's will was authentic. The 51% stake was hers, and Richard's attempts to challenge the decision had only made things worse for him. Patricia walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You ready for this?" "I've been ready for 40 years. Today was the day Richard Thompson would sign over control of the company he had stolen from his own father. Today was the day Margaret would finally take what was rightfully hers. But first, there was something else she needed to do. Eleanor Thompson was sitting in the conference room, wearing a blue dress that Margaret had bought for her. Her dementia had progressed in the past 6 months, but she still had moments of clarity, moments when she recognized faces, remembered names, understood what was happening around her. This was one of those moments. "Margaret," Eleanor's voice was thin but warm. "You came." "I told you I would." Margaret sat beside her, took her hand. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The new place is better." Eleanor smiled. "They have a piano." Margaret had moved Eleanor out of Thompson's senior living the day after the first hearing. She'd found a private facility, expensive but worth every penny, where Eleanor received actual care instead of sedatives and neglect. Richard had tried to stop the transfer. He'd failed. He'd tried a lot of things in the past 6 months. Appeals, motions, countersuits. All of them had failed. The criminal investigation was ongoing. The district attorney had filed charges 2 months ago: fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation. Richard was out on bail, but his passport had been seized. His assets were frozen. His reputation was destroyed. And Amber had left him 3 weeks after the first hearing. Turned out she wasn't interested in a man who couldn't buy her things anymore. "Is Richard coming today?" Eleanor asked. "He has to. It's part of the settlement." "I wish—" Eleanor's voice trailed off. Her eyes went distant for a moment, then came back. "I wish he had been different. I wish I had been stronger." "You were strong enough when it mattered," Margaret said. "You saved everything. The will, the recordings, the truth. You kept it safe when no one else could." "Harold asked me to." "I know." "He loved you, Margaret. He said you were the daughter he never had." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "He said you were the only person in the world who looked at him and saw a man instead of a dying patient." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. 40 years, and Harold's kindness still reached her from beyond the grave. The door opened. Patricia stuck her head in. "He's here." Margaret stood, straightened her dress, a new one, not the faded blue she'd worn in that courthouse. This one was emerald green, tailored, expensive, the dress of a woman who owned things. "Stay here," she told Eleanor. "I'll be back soon." She walked into the main conference room. Richard was already there, flanked by his new lawyer. Crawford had quit 2 months ago, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. The new lawyer looked young, nervous, completely out of his depth. Richard looked worse than Margaret had ever seen him. He'd lost weight. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands shook as he reached for the water glass in front of him. But his eyes,
His eyes were still the same, cold, calculating, waiting for an opportunity. "Let's get this over with," he said. Patricia spread the documents across the table. "Sign here, and here, and here." Richard's lawyer reviewed each page, whispered something to his client. Richard nodded mechanically, signed where indicated. With each signature, Margaret watched another piece of his empire transfer to her control. The company, the properties, the contracts. Everything Harold Thompson Sr. had built. Everything Richard had stolen and expanded through lies and manipulation. All of it becoming hers. When the last signature was done, Richard looked up at her. "Happy now?" "I'm not doing this to be happy, Richard." "Then why? Revenge? Justice?" He laughed bitterly. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won something?" "I think I've taken back what was stolen. From your father. From your mother. From Denise." Margaret paused. "From me." "Denise." Richard's face twisted. "You keep bringing up Denise like she was some kind of saint. She was weak. Couldn't handle pressure. Couldn't handle reality." "She couldn't handle you." "Same thing." Margaret stared at him. Even now, even with everything lost, he couldn't see it. Couldn't understand what he'd done, what he'd become. "Your children called me yesterday," she said quietly. Richard went still. Both of them, Richard Jr. and Melissa. They wanted to know if what they'd heard was true. About Denise, about their mother. "You had no right." "I told them the truth, all of it. About how she died. About why. About the lies you fed them for 20 years. Margaret's voice was steady. "They're flying in next week, to see their mother's grave. The one you never told them about." Richard's face crumbled. For a moment, just a moment, Margaret saw something human behind the mask. Pain. Real pain. "They're my children," he whispered. "They were her children too, and you stole their mother from them twice. Once when she died, and again every day after, when you let them believe she chose to abandon them. I was protecting them. You were protecting yourself, like always." The room was silent. Richard's lawyer was staring at the table. Patricia was watching Richard with something between disgust and pity. "What do you want from me, Margaret?" Richard finally asked. "An apology? A confession? You want me to get on my knees and beg?" "I want you to understand what you've done. To your father, to your mother, to Denise, to me, to your own children." Margaret shook her head. "But I don't think you can. I don't think you have the capacity. You don't know anything about me." "I know everything about you. I lived with you for 23 years. I watched you lie and manipulate and destroy. I watched you treat people like tools to be used and discarded." She leaned forward. "And I watched you do it all while telling yourself you were the victim." Richard's jaw tightened. "I built that company from nothing. You built it on stolen land and stolen money. You built it on your father's inheritance and your wife's labor. You built it on lies." Margaret stood. "And now it's mine. Not because I stole it, because it was always supposed to be mine. Harold knew what you were. He knew you'd destroy everything if given the chance. So he made sure someone else would be there to pick up the pieces." "My father was a fool." "Your father was the only person who ever really saw you. And he loved you anyway. That's why he didn't turn you in when he found out what you'd done. That's why he left the evidence with me instead of going to the police. He wanted to give you a chance to change." "Change into what?" "A decent human being. A man worthy of the name Thompson." Margaret picked up the signed documents. "You had 40 years, Richard. 40 years to become someone better. Instead, you got worse." She walked toward the door, then stopped. There's one more thing. Richard looked up. Your mother wants to see you. Something flickered across his face. What? Eleanor. She's here. She asked to see you before... Margaret paused.
Before she forgets who you are completely. Richard's mask cracked. Just a little. Just enough to show the scared little boy underneath. The one who had never learned how to love because no one had ever taught him. Why would you do that? His voice was barely a whisper. After everything, why would you let me see her? Because she asked. Because she's your mother. And because... Margaret took a breath. Because I'm not you, Richard. I don't destroy people for sport. I don't take away everything they love just because I can. She opened the door to the small conference room where Eleanor waited. You have 10 minutes. Richard stood slowly. His legs seemed unsteady as he walked past her, into the room where his mother sat. Margaret closed the door behind him. Through the glass, she watched him approach Eleanor. Watched the old woman look up at her son with eyes that were cloudy, but still filled with love. Mama, Richard said. His voice broke on the word. Richie. Eleanor held out her arms. My beautiful boy. Margaret turned away. Whatever happened in that room was between them now. A mother and son. Separated by years of cruelty and greed, trying to find each other one last time before the darkness closed in. Patricia appeared beside her. You okay? I don't know. That was a good thing you did, letting him see her. Was it? Margaret shook her head. I keep thinking about Harold, about what he would have wanted. What do you think he would have wanted? Redemption, for his son, for his family. Margaret sighed. Harold spent his whole life hoping Richard would change, hoping something would reach him. Maybe this will. Maybe seeing his mother, knowing it might be the last time, maybe that will finally break through. And if it doesn't, then at least I tried. At least I gave him the chance his father would have given him. They stood in silence, watching through the glass as Richard held his mother's hands and wept. 2 months later, the criminal trial began. Margaret testified for 3 days. She told the jury everything. Harold's story, Eleanor's recordings, Richard's decades of fraud and manipulation. She presented documents, played recordings, answered questions with calm precision. Richard's lawyer tried to paint her as a gold digger, tried to suggest she had manipulated an old woman with dementia, tried to claim the will was forged, the recordings were fabricated, the whole case was a conspiracy. The jury didn't buy it. They found Richard Thompson guilty on all counts: fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation, forgery. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. Margaret was in the courtroom when they led him away in handcuffs. He looked at her one last time, and for just a moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not hatred, acceptance. Maybe even a small piece of gratitude. Then he was gone, and Margaret was left standing in an empty courtroom, holding the weight of 40 years in her hands. The next year was busy. Margaret restructured Thompson Construction, renaming it Johnson Thompson Development in honor of both Harold and herself. She hired an ethical management team. She implemented fair wages, good benefits, honest business practices. The company thrived. She moved Eleanor into a new facility, the best in Alabama, and visited her every week. Sometimes Eleanor knew who she was. Sometimes she didn't. But Margaret came anyway, because that's what family did. Richard Jr. and Melissa came back to Montgomery. The reunion was awkward, painful, full of tears and accusations and long silences. But slowly, over months of difficult conversations, they began to rebuild something like a family. They visited their mother's grave together, the three of them, standing in a Tennessee cemetery, laying flowers on a stone that had been unmarked for 20 years. Margaret told them stories about Denise, things she'd heard from Eleanor, from Patricia, from people who had known her before Richard destroyed her. She wanted them to know that their mother had loved them, had fought for them, had never, ever abandoned them. On the anniversary of Harold Thompson's death, Margaret drove to the cemetery where he was buried. She'd never been there before, hadn't known where it was until Patricia found the records. She stood at his grave for a long time. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "I protected the truth. I made sure your son faced consequences for what he did." She paused. "And I tried to give him a chance to change, just like you would have wanted." The wind rustled through the trees. A bird sang somewhere nearby. "I don't know if he'll take that chance. I don't know if 12 years in prison will teach him anything, or if he'll come out the same man he went in." She knelt, placed a flower on the grave. "But I know I did everything I could, everything you trusted me to do." She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees. "Thank you, Harold, for seeing me when no one else did, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for giving me the strength to become who I was always meant to be." She walked away from the grave, back toward her car, back toward the life she had built from the ashes of the one Richard had tried to destroy. 3 years later, Margaret stood at a podium, accepting an award for Businesswoman of the Year from the Montgomery Chamber of Commerce. The audience was full of people who had once dismissed her, contractors who had refused to take her calls, bankers who had denied her loans, politicians who had backed Richard in his campaigns. Now they were applauding her, praising her vision, eager to be associated with her success. She thought about that courthouse, the barefoot woman with nothing, the husband who had laughed at her poverty. "I want to thank someone who isn't here today," she said into the microphone. "A man named Harold Thompson, who died 40 years ago. Harold taught me that your worth isn't measured by what you own or who you know. It's measured by who you are when no one's watching, by how you treat people who can't do anything for you, by whether you choose kindness when cruelty would be easier." She looked out at the audience. Harold was dying when I met him, alone, abandoned, forgotten. But he never stopped being kind, never stopped believing that people were worth caring about, never stopped hoping that even the most broken person could be redeemed. Her voice caught. "I try to live by his example. I try to run my company the way he would have run it, with honesty, integrity, and compassion. I don't always succeed, but every day I wake up and try again." She smiled. "Because that's what Harold would have wanted, and because that's the least I can do for the man who gave me everything." After the ceremony, a young woman approached her, nervous, early 20s, something familiar in her face. "Mrs. Johnson? I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Denise Thompson, Jr. I'm Richard's granddaughter." Margaret went very still. "My dad, Richard Jr., he told me what you did for our family, how you found my grandmother's grave, how you helped him understand what really happened." The young woman's eyes were wet. "I just wanted to say thank you for telling the truth, for not letting my grandmother be forgotten." Margaret took the girl's hand. "Your grandmother was a good woman. She loved your father and your aunt more than anything in the world. She just—" Margaret paused. "She just got caught in something she couldn't survive." "I know. Dad told me." Denise Jr. wiped her eyes. "I visit her grave every year now. I talk to her, tell her about my life. I like to think she can hear me." "I think she can too." The young woman hugged her, this stranger who carried the name of a woman destroyed by Margaret's own husband. And Margaret hugged her back.
because that's what family did. That night, Margaret sat on the porch of the house she'd bought, a small ranch on the east side of town, 3 blocks from where her mama had grown up. Jerome lived next door. Patricia visited every Sunday for dinner. She looked up at the stars and thought about everything that had led her here. A dying man's trust, a mother's hidden courage, a husband's betrayal, a 40-year secret finally brought into the light. She thought about Richard sitting in his prison cell. She'd heard he'd started a Bible study group, started counseling other inmates, started, maybe, to become the man his father had always hoped he could be. She thought about Eleanor, who had passed away peacefully 6 months ago, holding Margaret's hand, finally at peace. She thought about Harold, whose grave she visited every year on the anniversary of his death. And she thought about herself, the 19-year-old nursing assistant who had shown kindness to a dying stranger. The woman who had carried an impossible secret for 40 years. The wife who had lost everything and somehow found her way back. Jerome came out onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You okay?" "Yeah." Margaret took the cup from him. "I'm okay." "You thinking about Richard?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things." "You did good, Margaret. Harold would be proud." "I hope so." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 cousins who had been through hell and come out the other side. "You know what the hardest part was?" Margaret finally said. "What?" "Not the trial, not the hearings, not even walking into that courthouse with nothing." She looked at Jerome. "The hardest part was letting go of the anger, the hatred, the desire to destroy Richard the way he destroyed everyone else." "But you did let it go." "I had to, because I realized that's what he would have wanted. He wanted me to become like him, to let the bitterness poison me the way it poisoned him." She shook her head. "I couldn't give him that satisfaction." "So what do you feel now, when you think about him?" Margaret considered the question. "Pity," she said finally. "I feel pity for a man who had everything and understood nothing, who was loved by his parents, his wives, his children, and threw all of it away because he couldn't see past his own greed." "That's generous." "It's honest," Margaret smiled. "Harold taught me that the truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and doesn't give you the satisfaction you want. But it's still better than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "Living in lies, like Richard did, like he made everyone around him do." She stood, walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at the stars. "The truth set me free, even when it hurt, even when it cost me everything I thought I had. It set me free." Jerome joined her at the railing. "You know what Grandma used to say? About truth?" "What?" "She used to say truth is like water. You can dam it up, hold it back, pretend it doesn't exist. But eventually, it always finds a way through." Margaret nodded slowly. "Harold said the same thing, almost exactly the same words. Maybe that's where he heard it, from the old folks around here." Jerome put his arm around her shoulders. "You carried that water for 40 years, Margaret, and now it's finally flowing where it's supposed to go." She leaned into her cousin's embrace and let the peace wash over her. 40 years ago, a dying man had trusted her with a secret. 23 years ago, she had married his son, hoping love could change what fear had created. 6 months ago, she had walked into a courthouse with nothing but the truth and the faith that justice would prevail. And now she stood here, whole, wealthy, free, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the legacy she had built. Margaret Johnson had lost everything and gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that she had kept her promise, honored her trust, and become exactly the woman Harold Thompson had always believed she could be. The woman